Morning, Chief Superintendent. My name is Michael Scott. I'm counsel for a number of the victims' families and those that were directly impacted by the mass casualty. When you left here yesterday, I expect you heard Chief Commissioner McDonald confirm that you were to remain under oath before coming back this morning?
Yes.
And can you confirm that between when you left the stand yesterday to when you resumed your testimony this morning, that you have not been contacted or had any contact with anyone verbally or in writing with respect to the content of your evidence?
Correct.
Now, yesterday, Commission Counsel, in questioning you, raised a phone call that you had received on your cell phone from Commissioner Lucki. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And to the best of your recollection, can you tell us what the content of that conversation was?
The initial part of the conversation, and as I said, was the Commissioner calling to me on my cell at my desk in my office, at the time on my own. Initially, it was wishing me all the best, and I would call it a wellness check. And then she quickly moved into, I would say, the reason for the call, which had to do with her request to me to provide her with a gun inventory of the guns that were found in the possession of the gunman on the day that he was killed at the Big Stop gas station, and to have that prepared and forwarded to her. Can't recall whether she said directly back to her or through the CO, but as I testified to yesterday, the normal course of action would be through the commanding officer and up the chain.
Did you say you received that phone call at your desk in your office?
Yes.
And was that on your cell phone?
On my cell phone.
Okay, your work phone or your personal phone?
My work cell phone.
And would it be unusual for the commissioner to contact you directly?
I think it's the only time I've heard from the commissioner directly over the last 3 years or prior to. Obviously, I've had one-on-one conversations with her where she's come to the division, but in terms of a phone call, that would be atypical.
And to the extent that you have communication with the commissioner at national headquarters, presumably that would come through the chain of command to you through people between you and the commissioner.
Well, certainly it would normally be the commanding officer, my direct report in the division, who would come to see me to pass on a request or a message from the commissioner or the deputy commissioner, typically.
Did it strike you as unusual that you were getting a direct phone call from the commissioner being asked about the gun inventory?
Yeah, unusual, but again, under the circumstances, the extraordinary circumstances, I could understand her wanting that information, as I said yesterday, for the purpose of informing her senior executive RCMP team. So that's the deputy commissioners and equivalents that sit with her, and surely we're sitting with her daily, if not more frequently, post the mass casualty event.
So that was your understanding, is the reason that information was being requested was to brief her own staff and also to make sure that she had a fulsome understanding of the facts surrounding the incident?
Yes, that was my understanding.
Did the commissioner say anything to you to indicate that, or is that just something that you assumed?
He didn't indicate to me, so that was my understanding.
Okay. Did the commissioner provide any indication as to the purpose for her wanting that information?
I don't recall that at all.
As my friend Ms. Young noted yesterday, that phone call never came up in the course of your interview with the Mass Casualty Commission, correct?
Correct.
And Ms. Young asked you why you didn't mention that phone call when you were being interviewed. And I think your response was that you couldn't answer, or you didn't want to answer that question until you had had a chance to speak to counsel. Is that correct? Did I hear you correctly?
I wasn't at liberty to answer that question at the time.
Okay. You know the answer to that question.
Yes, I do.
And in answering that question, would it require you to divulge the substance of any legal advice that you've received?
Yes, and for the commissioners, I would like to put it on the record at this time that I would like to waive my solicitor-client privilege in order to answer the question from counsel.
Ms. Ward, it's pretty obvious.
I would say that Chief Superintendent Campbell can waive his privilege for this limited purpose.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chief Superintendent Campbell. Please answer the question.
Yes, sir. So prior to coming to testify, I have spoken to independent legal counsel and have had discussions with him about this very issue. During the course of my preparation for my interview with the Mass Casualty Commission counsel, who examined me yesterday, there were two issues that I wanted to raise and did raise with Department of Justice counsel, Ward and McPhee, who are here today, and received advice from them. And the one issue that you're asking me about, as did Ms. Young yesterday, was a part of that discussion. And the advice that I received was not to proactively disclose the conversation and the emails leading up to the meeting of the 28th. I knew from my notes and the emails that I had prepared and submitted that it was obviously relevant to what would become the infamous phone call of April 28th and the subsequent SECU testimony of various witnesses, and was troubled by that and wanted their advice and was advised to take a reactive posture. My question was whether or not I should proactively disclose that during the course of my MCC interview.
If I could respond.
Ms. Ward?
I think there's been a misunderstanding as between Chief Superintendent Leather and counsel. I'm not sure, well, I didn't know until now what Chief Superintendent Leather understood from our discussion. Shortly before his interview with Commission counsel, he had raised a document of which we had no knowledge in the context of our discussions about the meeting with Commissioner Lucki. From his description of the document, we thought it was potentially relevant, but possibly privileged, and based on assurances of confidentiality given to those who were involved in the making of the document. As such, we told Chief Superintendent Leather we would obtain that document and review it and disclose it if it was relevant.
I do have to object. This witness is under oath testifying to the exact matters that Ms. Ward is now providing her narrative about, and I believe it's completely inappropriate for Ms. Ward to give her narrative on the very issue that this witness is testifying about at this very moment. It may impact his narrative based on Mr. Scott's follow-up questions, and I just believe it's completely inappropriate at this stage for this narrative to come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Chief Superintendent Leather, why don't you step back outside, and to the extent that what might become evidence, part of your evidence, you won't hear the exchange. Thank you. Ms. Ward?
Thank you, Commissioner. I wanted to say when we became aware of this document, which Chief Superintendent Leather had connected to discussions of the April 28th meeting, we immediately alerted Commission Council Director Mr. Cromwell of its existence and undertook to obtain the document and review it and state a position. We've now reviewed it, and it will be disclosed imminently. At no time did we advise Chief Superintendent Leather not to speak about it if it came up and not to speak the truth. But we were unaware of any connection of that document to the call from Commissioner Lucki. So I'm not sure what the connection is, but I do not recall a discussion about the emails and the lead up to the meeting, and he was certainly, from our position, not advised not to tell the truth.
I don't think the issue was ever to tell the truth.
Or to hide anything.
I think it was proactive versus reactive. Oops, thank you, Ms. Ward. Let's call the witness back then. Mr. Scott, he's going to answer the question, and you're going to continue on with your questions.
I will, thank you.
Thank you, Chief Superintendent Leather. Mr. Scott will continue with his questions.
Chief Superintendent, I just wanted to get some clarification because you talked about, I think, a couple of different lawyers, and perhaps you were talking about your preparations for both your testimony before the Mass Casualty Commission, but did I hear also correctly you were referencing your preparations to give evidence before the House of Commons Committee?
Well, I was specifically referring to the preparation for my testimony for the MCC interview,
Where you were interviewed by Ms. Young.
where I was advised by DOJ counsel.
All right. And are you saying that that the lawyers that prepared you for that were counsel for the Attorney General of Canada?
Yes.
And that would be Ms. Ward and Ms. McPhee?
Yes.
Okay. And when you said that that you received advice to not raise the issue of this communication with Commissioner Lucki, was that advice given to you by counsel for the Attorney General?
Yes, I was trying to make the distinction between a proactive and a reactive disclosure of the information. That's the nature of the conversation we had. That, of course, if I was asked during the course of the interview or today, that I would respond truthfully and with the full extent of the question, but it had more to do with whether I should bring it up proactively during the course of my interview with Ms. Young or not.
Okay. And sorry, earlier you had mentioned that that you had sought advice from your own private counsel. That's a separate issue, is it? In terms of your disclosure of the call with Commissioner Lucki?
No, it pertains to this very issue post my interview, given my discomfort with how things proceeded and the fact that it didn't surface during the course of the interview. And I felt I needed independent legal counsel to get advice on how to manage the situation on a go-forward basis.
All right. So your testimony today is that in preparing to be interviewed by the Mass Casualty Commission, specifically by Ms. Young, you met with counsel for the Department of Justice, Ms. Ward and Ms. McPhee?
Yes.
And in the course of that preparation, you were advised not to bring up this communication with Commissioner Lucki?
Yes,
And it wasn't raised by Commission counsel in the interview.
correct.
And to the best of your knowledge, the fact of that phone call had not been raised in any other forum before you were interviewed by Ms. Young.
But to the best of my knowledge, it had not.
Right. You had no reason to think that Ms. Young would be aware of that phone call previously.
No, I had no reason to believe that, and certainly not from the interview.
And what you're saying is that after that interview was completed, you felt uncomfortable and sought independent legal advice.
Yes, for the very, here we are today dealing with this very issue, and on how to address this very issue should it surface. And here we are, and I felt I needed independent counsel on how to navigate that.
You were concerned that it might be viewed as you're improperly holding back relevant information.
Correct.
And you were fully aware of the fact that in being interviewed by the Mass Casualty Commission, that it was critically important that you provide all relevant information.
Yes.
And that's why you were uncomfortable and sought separate advice.
Correct.
Is there any other information that you were advised to not raise that you think is relevant to the substance of this inquiry?
There were two issues that I raised. One pertained to the phone call and notes around the commissioner. The second refers to what is known as a wellness review that was conducted on the senior officers of the division last summer and into the fall by an independent third-party consulting firm in Ottawa, focusing on the wellness of the senior officers in Nova Scotia related to the impacts from Portapic, and more specific to myself, I can say for certain that during the course of the interview that I had with the consultant or the investigator for that report, that I, on the record, in a recording, made comments about the meeting with Commissioner Lucki on April 28th. So there we had a recorded statement taken from me that was provided by me to an investigator, albeit, as has been stated by DOJ counsel, on an internal matter, nonetheless contained my depiction or assessment of that call some year plus later, which would have had much more context than I had on the 28th, because, as you recall from my testimony, either here or at SECU, how caught off guard by that I was, and then to learn what I did subsequently, and was then able to share my observations and thoughts about what had occurred on the 28th in much more detail to that investigator.
Sorry, what was the organization that conducted that?
Quintet Consulting. I don't know the rest of the name. They're a well-known firm in Ottawa that the RCMP hired to conduct this review.
And your understanding was that the scope of that review was to assess the impact of the mass casualty on senior officers?
Yes, and then to make recommendations on how we could, as a management team, look to support the wellness of the senior officers in the division specifically. It did not extend to the NCOs or the constables. It was just because of the impacts that we were seeing. In particular, 3 chief superintendents, Robin, Gray, and myself, and our correspondence to the deputy commissioner and the CO about the need to address this, come up with a plan, and implement some recommendations. And it was obviously the decision of headquarters to hire this firm, who are specialists, to conduct this review. And I can just say for myself, again, my statement would contain relevant information pertaining to the meeting of April 28th.
When we say the review was intended to examine the impacts on senior officers, can you be more specific? What kind of impacts were being reviewed?
The wellness. So it truly was an internal wellness review that Quintet was hired to oversee. And if not all, the majority of our officer cadre were interviewed to share their thoughts and feelings and recommendations on a course forward to help the CO and myself and the admin and personnel officer with a roadmap, a plan to help support the senior officers, whether it's transfers or whatever the case may be, based on the feedback that was received and the recommendations made.
To the best of your knowledge, was Chief Superintendent Campbell interviewed as part of that process?
To the best of my knowledge, he was.
And do you recall who interviewed you in that process?
By name, no. He was a retired Navy captain, for what it's worth. I think he was the same principal that did, if not all, the majority of the interviews. But I'm sorry, I don't recall his name.
And approximately when was that interview conducted?
June or July of last year.
2021.
Yes.
To the best of your understanding, was a report of any kind completed in that matter?
Yes, it's my understanding.
And have you seen that report?
No, I have not.
Have you received any information about the outcome of the findings of that report?
A week ago, we received an update from the CHRO, or Chief Human Resource Officer, with a series of recommendations for the new commanding officer as it relates to the wellness and supports for the members, senior officers in the division.
And those recommendations were sent to you. You've seen them personally?
I believe they were sent to all those that participated in the review.
Okay. Do you now, or have you ever had a transcript or a recording of the interview that you gave in that process?
No, and as I recall from the joining instructions, although a recording was taken for the purpose of assisting the investigator consultant, it was noted that it would not be retained, but a summary would be made from the interview.
Did you ever receive a summary?
No.
And you said that it would be relevant to the April 28th meeting that's been raised in this matter. And to be clear, you're talking about the meeting by teleconference with Commissioner Lucki and Superintendent Campbell and Leah Scanlon.
And Ms. Bergerman and Deputy Brennan, yes, that call.
And am I correct that the reason that became a live issue in the interview that you did as part of that review was given the impact that meeting had on morale?
Well, for me, it was a one-on-one interview. It was based on the impact it had on me, and I was describing the impact that it had on me and why it had the impact it did, and my observations of the impact it had on the other people that I could see in the room with me.
And you said that the content of that interview that was taken last year would have information relevant to that meeting. Is there, to the best of your recollection, did you discuss anything in that meeting that would not already be known to the Mass Casualty Commission by way of your notes or the reporting of others?
Certainly by way of my notes, because my notes were admittedly rather brief as it relates to that meeting. So yes, there would be additional context and details because I had had the benefit of over a year to reflect and learn more about what had gone on in that key 24 hours beforehand in my discussions with Ms. Scanlon and Mr. Campbell.
And given that it was almost a year ago, presumably your memory would have been to some extent fresher than it is now?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow your question.
Does the fact that that interview was conducted about a year before now, do you have any sense that your memory at the time when you were recounting it in that interview would be better or clearer than it is now, given the passage of time?
I would say yes.
And bringing us full circle, do I hear you as saying that it was suggested to you by counsel that you not raise the fact of that interview in preparation for your interview with the Mass Casualty Commission?
I asked specifically whether I should bring that up proactively or not.
And what were you told?
Not to.
And who told you to do that?
It was Ms. McPhee and Ms. Ward that I had the conversation with in my boardroom at headquarters.
So when you talk about the two issues, one would be the fact of that interview, and the second was the phone call with Commissioner Lucki.
Phone call in my notes and the context and the lead up to the call on the 28th. And for my belief that was, now referring to the call on the 28th, that my role in the lead up to the 28th was a key piece of the story, which I began to tell at SECU on the record. And it's on the public record there already, and of course, there's no reason why it shouldn't be available to the MCC.